Michael in California wants to know, does free will exist? Well, I'm gonna not talk for a minute. So welcome, Michael.
Hey, Matt, pleasure to speak with you again. So I'm gonna, well, first of all, I would like to just say that I think language is gonna make a definitive answer somewhat vague, but so I do believe free will exists, and let's define it as the core abstract belief that people have the capacity to act freely, or I guess to put it more simply, just that a person could have chosen to do otherwise. So is that a good definition to start off with, or?
Well, I said I was going to stay quiet because I really want to find out what Genevieve has to say about this. But I will say that if you define it the way you did, then no, it's an awful definition, because what you defined it as was the belief that people have the capacity to act freely. And that definitely exists. But whether or not they have the capacity to act freely is the issue of whether or not there's free will, not whether or not people believe they have free will.
Okay. Well, let's just start. We can just shave off that beginning part. Just say that free will is the capacity to act freely, or you could choose to do otherwise.
I don't know Genevieve's thoughts, so I want to get Genevieve's thoughts on. What's your thoughts on free will? Easy subject. Just dump it right out here real quick.
It's not like that's something that we haven't been arguing forever. And I still can never really decide exactly where I land on the free will argument. I think that a lot of the choices that we face every day might appear as choices, but they're really not. I don't necessarily know how much of my own decision making is a result of just my genetics or my thought patterns that have sort of been, embedded in me since the beginning of my life. I don't know exactly how much agency I necessarily have and how much of it has to do with external forces around me. I think we like to think that free will exists. I go back and forth on whether or not I really think it does. So much of what we do every day has nothing to do with us and our choices. Random things happen all of the time, and we're sort of forced to act on instinct sometimes. But
I absolutely agree with you. I think that some of our choices are made subconsciously. Some things we're constrained where we don't have choice. But I think that as free, I would call us free agents. I think that by necessity implies that we have free will. You could make the argument that, well, some things are determined, some things are random, it's one or the other, and free will doesn't exist, or other, try to deductively argue for it. I think that the key point that I would make is the agency and the intentionality. To me, that's what free will is. We can talk about compatibilism. I believe in causal determinism in the natural world, but I think where the split happens, and it's almost, for me, it's a split between naturalism and we'll say like metaphysical naturalism and metaphysical non-naturalism. It starts when you start talking about philosophy of mind, what is agency, and what are the reasons you make choices? Can you freely do it? But yeah, so I'll leave it at that. You can respond to those thoughts.
Yeah, so I will say that we have two other callers that are waiting that both want to discuss free will. I'm going to sum up my answer to yours really simply because I've done this for a long time and have answered this question in a lot of different ways, because my thoughts on this have changed over the years. I am still a largely Dennett style compatibilist in that I don't think there's a conflict between determinism and free will, provided we define free will in a very particular way. I don't think that we have free will in any extraordinary sense. I think in Dennett wrote a book called Elbow Room, the varieties of free will worth wanting. And one of the things he pointed out is that we have the freest will we could imagine. If somebody's arguing you don't have free will because you can't flap your wings and fly off the earth, that's not really talking about that. I had a discussion with Rationality Rules, and we sorted out some language stuff. What I will say is that I have a will, and you have a will, as far as I can tell, and Genevieve has a will. I don't know how free it is. I'm not remotely suggesting that it is decoupled from the past. But I can also not say that the past, that this causal chain is necessarily all that's involved. I don't know how much randomness exists in the universe. I don't know that any randomness exists in the universe. Maybe what we call randomness is generally patterns that we haven't been able to nail down. It's an interesting line of thought. But the example that I've used many times is, and I started this when Sam Harris and I were touring, because Dennett and I both think that Sam's a compatibilist. He just doesn't realize it. And the biggest difference with me and Dennett is that I don't think it matters. I think that Sam and I are pretty much in agreement on what we have. And that is, if Sam and I were sitting on stage and I said, look, you could go to the front of the stage and jump off, or I could throw you off the stage. One of those is an act of your will and your volition. And one of those is an act of me circumventing your will to impose my own. And that circumvention of will is what I think we're talking about when we say free will being violated. Because if I'm preventing you from doing what you wanted to do, or forcing you to do something that you didn't want to do, then I am imposing my will over yours. Doesn't matter. My apologies. It doesn't matter to me whether that's free will, whether it was free, whether it was decoupled from a past causal chain, whether it came up on a whim. I don't think that quantum indeterminacy has anything to do with that. I don't think you suddenly get free will by adding randomness. At the end of the day, though, my view...
I agree. And my point was that dichotomy fails. I agree with you 100% on that. But I guess maybe, and the real reason I called was because I wanted to get your insight, because I know you've been exposed to it so much and have thought about it probably more deeply than I have. But to me, it comes down to how you view philosophy of mind and agency. Now, I would agree that, everything that has come up to the point of even my conversation with you has been caused, has, a form of causal determinism. But I guess my argument would be, in that causal chain, the mind, the free will agency of the mind is what creates free will. And I think to say, to use the word compatibilism is really just a language game in a sense. And granted, I know this comes back to a lot of people who want to adhere to strict naturalism or, et cetera. But so how would you address it from philosophy of mind along those lines?
Well, for me, the philosophy of mind, all right, and I could just be wrong, but when I hear that, what we're talking about is the notion that there are other minds, and being able to place yourself in the position of other minds to get a reflexive sort of assessment of, oh, if I do this, this happens. If I were that person and I did this, this is what would happen. The ability to move from the intentional stance into like, or in and out of an observational stance. Dennett talked about this with the, and I'm going to get this partially wrong, but the Cartesian theater of the mind. All I can say is having zero expertise in any of it, I've spent a lot of time thinking about will and free will. And what I said is probably all that I have to say on it. And that is that I have a will, you have a will. I think that what we're generally talking about when we talk about violations of free will is one person imposing their will on another, because I never hear anybody say that their free will was violated by the rain. Their free will wasn't violated by, the weather or anything like that.
Not to interrupt, but I could argue that, the approaching hurricane is going to violate my ability to make free choices as to my actions. But
I agree it does. But my point is, in the entire history, no. And my point is, in the entire history of discussions about free will, have you ever heard anybody say their free will was violated by a hurricane? We don't think about things in that term. It's always about the interpersonal. Right. Now, I could be wrong. Maybe somebody does think that way, but that's how I think about it.
The reason I brought that up was just because you're comparing two agents and the ability of one agent to impinge on the free will action of another agent, which,
yes, because that's what I think is all that matters. I think that the interaction between thinking agents is everything that we talk about when we're talking about free will.
Right. I agree. But I mean, why do we want to come up with this term compatibilism? I pulled up the numbers on the Phil survey polls, and it's 47.2 believe in free will, 59.1 compatibilism, 13.7 libertarian, and then no free will, like 12.2, other 14.9. But so I think
I don't care.
Yeah. Well, but
I don't.
But I'm just
I
saying,
don't care.
well, why do we want to use the word compatibilism when it's really free will then?
Compatibilism is not okay. Compatibilism is a response to the claim that free will and determinism are in conflict. Compatibilism say that free will and determinism are not in conflict. That's why we use the label. Compatibilism isn't free will.
Right. No, but
Compatibilism is a specific response to the claim that free will and determinism are in conflict. And compatibilism says no, they're not. That's why we use that label.
But it's not, it's causal determinism. It's not just determinant, but causal determinism. Yeah, I know. This is we could talk about this or debate it for hours. I just wanted to get your insights on it.
Actually, we couldn't, because I'm going to go on to two other callers who want to talk about free will and determinism.
Yeah. No, I think if you really start thinking deeply about philosophy of mind and agency, I think, well, at least for me, I've come to the conclusion that free will is true, and compatibilism is just a word that's trying to combine, two broader paradigms of analyzation.
Okay. I love the fact that you called to get my thoughts, saying that I'd clearly spent more time thinking deeply about this. And then when you disagree, you suggest that if I just studied philosophy of mind more, I would agree with you.
Okay.
Maybe I will, but I got to move on.